If you're like me and a huge fan of competitive Star Wars Unlimited, then this past weekend was exactly what you've been waiting for. Star City Gamescom Baltimore took place, and there were not just one, not two, but three separate events for competitive level Star Wars Unlimited play, and there was a lot of stuff to learn from these events, so let's get right into it. Now, I will say that these events are collated with the assistance of a number of people actually in the KTOD Discord. Wu and Professor Numpty were busy gathering all of the different top 8 lists, including some top 8 placements themselves, as well as the K-Mitch was able to collate all the numbers, not just from these events, but also including some of the 1Ks from the previous week. So shout out to all of them, and shout out to everybody in the KTOD Discord for putting in all the effort to get all this stuff together. Now, we don't have the exact deck list, so we're going to be talking about a number of the details from the events and then some speculated deck lists for the winning list. Let's talk about the Friday event. We had 45 players for this, and then the reason that the bracket on screen looks bizarre is, well, the players split in the round of 8, and as far as I can tell, based on the notes people had, it sounds as though half the top 8 just said, all right, I'm going to bed, probably getting ready for the next day. The bracket broke down kind of like this. We obviously don't know what the results would have been from some of these, although we can kind of surmise how it would go, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But at the top of the bracket, we had Green Palpatine versus Luke Green. I am completely unsurprised that Palpatine took this down. The power of control magic, a guaranteed control magic on a body, is incredible, and Luke being a mid-range is generally going to fold to these later game control decks, or what I presume, since we don't have the exact list, was a later game control deck. There were rumored to be some other variations of Palpatine that are more mid-rangey-ish floating around, but in this particular case, I'm not surprised at all by this result. Now, in the next part of the bracket, we didn't get the result for this one, the Young Han versus Yellow Boba. I've only played this matchup a few times, but I could tell you from experience, the players that I played against were absolutely not happy to see Yellow Boba. We don't know whether this was a bounty hunter heavy version, doing wombo stuff with Toro, or was it a more classic version, or was it one of those all space ones, which have kind of fallen out of favor in recent weeks. But either way, I would have bet on Boba to take this. Now, if we were to roll back time and have them play it out for the next round for the semis, Palpatine into Boba Yellow, I could kind of see this going either way. It would depend on pilot experience, obviously draws. This matchup is closer, I think, than it was in set 1. And in set 1, there were opportunities for Palpatine Green to take it anyway, because Boba is just a slightly slower aggro deck. So you can't always get in under what they want to do. You give them some breathing room, potentially, depending on Bodhi's or now Bazines and other things, to get their ramp off. And then if they do, Star Destroyers are a problem, as are all of the other big, mean green things that come into play. So after that, looking at the second half of the bracket, we had Han versus Palpatine. This does surprise me a little bit, but there is a list that was provided, and we'll talk about that momentarily. I can see how Han would take this. On paper, if somebody had asked me before the match was played out or before they posted the results, I feel like I would have given the edge to Palpatine on the back of the control magic plays. And when I say control magic, we're of course talking about the Palpatine deploy. But after looking at the list, maybe there's some things there. Now, at the bottom of the bracket, we have Luke and Palpatine. Once again, I would have not been surprised to see Palpatine take that over again. So in the finals, we see, of course, Palpatine versus Han. It could have been ultimately the same finals again if this whole bracket was played out, because maybe the Palpatine at the top beats the Boba, meets Han in the finals, or it could have been a Palpatine mirror. There's a lot of different ways this could have gone, because personally, I feel like these matchups are somewhat close, with the exception of the important one, I guess, which is the Palpatine-Han matchup. I'm not clear on who is the favorite here, and with that, let's talk about the actual list. I've played against a lot of Han Green, and of course, this is running Echo Base as opposed to ECL. I have not played with Han all that much. I played with more Palpatine and against Palpatine. So I generally have more experience on that side. And the big thing that stands out to me here is, of course, the Tech DJ plays. Those are now kind of common knowledge. I could absolutely see that playing in and disrupting the Palpatine player just enough to really ruin their day. Now, there are, of course, other disruption elements, including a Miser's copy of Kira and Cunning. Those can definitely play in. The confiscates possibly would have mattered depending on whether there's maybe a traitorous or something, although admittedly there isn't a whole lot to traitorous. It's possible. I could definitely see this deck, the Han deck, just doing what Palpatine does, but a little bit better. That is, it can ramp more aggressively due to the fact that Han does Han things, and therefore it's able to start slamming threats, recursive threats in the form of Home 1, able to bring other things back, and maybe just overwhelming the Palpatine player. All right, let's talk about the big show. That is the Saturday event with 63 players, all duking it out for this particular 2K. Now, I only had the seed numbers, or only found the seed numbers, for the first place, Sabine Green, versus the 8th seed, Kira ECL specifically. I don't know what the other ones were placement-wise, so I'm kind of reverse engineering things by the way the results ended up because we knew what the finals were. I know that all sounds very strange, but the point is the semis may have looked a little bit differently. We definitely had a Han mono yellow win the whole thing though, and that took it down through a clearly fierce competitive field. So we know the initial top 8 for sure and the way the matchups went and what they were up against. Sabine versus Kira, I'll be honest, I hear from every blue-green villain player that every matchup is good. There are no bad matchups, and I see it all the time, and it never seems to play out that way. Inevitably, they end up biting the dust like the rest against Sabine, as we see here. The only matchup that I do feel is that I know for certain, because I play the other side of it, that feels hopeless is playing as Mono Yellow Boba into these Kira lists, into these hypothetical either Krennic or Iden, but realistically, they're all morphing to Kira. And I can absolutely understand why Sabine would have an advantage here, depending on the specific list. Again, we don't have the exact deck list for these players, but it definitely makes sense logically here. Next up, Blue Han versus Palpatine. This is a matchup that I'm not familiar with. I could definitely see how Blue Han takes it. Again, similar to what we saw in the Friday event where the Han lists are able to aggressively push their threats. And Palpatine, while it's great, oh yeah, your guys are damaged, there are certain things that if they just come down too early or your Palpatine's not online yet, will absolutely ruin your day. A very early Poe, for example, can absolutely crash through a ton of things because, by the way, it still has 4 health, so it survives punching into, say, Emperor's Royal Guard or something like that. I could definitely see how Han takes over this game. After a long, grueling day, I could also see maybe the control decks are just struggling here because it's mentally draining. There's a lot of factors that go into this, but this doesn't seem unreasonable or a massive upset. Now, I am making some estimations because it was only notes as to what was there, as to what the seedings were exactly. We only know the matchups. We're going to take a look at this mono yellow Han list, or at least an estimated version of it, and see if we can pick it apart, because this one is fascinating to me. I would not have expected Yellow Han to be able to race Sabine, although if it's doing the same set 1 Boba things of being able to cunning your board and then simultaneously apply pressure, I can definitely see it. I've been playing a lot of Boba Yellow. I have been coming around on the Sabine matchup, but Sabine is super explosive in this set. It definitely feels closer than it was in set 1, maybe even Sabine favored. We'll have to see how this shakes out long term. I'm coming up with lines myself to try and make this happen. If I had an event tomorrow, I would probably also be taking Boba Yellow. More on that later, but we'll have to see how this plays out. And the semis, as I said, this was kind of all over the place. So we're going to just jump right into the deck list for this. Now, as mentioned, this is a presumed deck list, at least at the time of this recording. I believe Rebel Resource is rumored to be getting an interview with the winner. So Hopefully they'll put that up and we can learn a lot more. I don't think there's anything that's really out of place in this list if you were to tell me what are you going to play in Yellow Han. The only thing that really jumps out is like, well, that's sort of weird at first glance, is the main deck and New Adventure and then some parts of the sideboard. We'll touch on that momentarily. The main board is just a collection of solid mono yellow cards, which kind of explains why the New Adventure is there. You, of course, can get a lot of value either out of ambushers or bouncers or insert whatever if it happens to have damage to set up the New Adventures. Being able to DJ their resources with tech also gives you an additional level of disruption in addition to the Kira and Cunning hand disruption. There's a lot of different ways to both attack your opponent and apply pressure. And as I mentioned before, I could see this beating Sabine on the back of Cunning. Your bodies are sizable. You know, if you drop a turn 1 Ezra, that controls the board for a bit. You also have some ambushers and sturdy units in the form of R2-D2 and C-3PO, as well as universal answers like Waylay. And then, of course, Bodhi only adds onto, which I didn't mention for the New Adventure, but you can shred people's hands with New Adventure, Bodhi, and Cunning. Or Kira, for that matter, as well as also, I mean, Kira doesn't actually remove it from their hand, but it definitely makes their life more difficult. And from what I'm told, the new Millennium Falcon, not just the old one, actually isn't too bad. I haven't tried it too much myself, but I'm interested in testing out this list and seeing how it does, because there's definitely some cool stuff. Now, out of the board, it looks like we got Fell the Dragon, which is the main thing that kind of surprises me, alongside Grogu. I'm not a huge fan of those, but I could see them coming in certain matchups. I'm very anxious to see this interview, if it materializes, to hear the pilot's thoughts on how this was constructed, because there's a lot of elements here that seem very obvious, and then there's a handful of others that, having not played the deck, kind of stand out to me as, that's really curious. So we'll see where this one ends up. On to the last day, we had a mere 24 players in this one. Top 8 was Sabine, 3 Bosks, which that's just mind-blowing to me. 2 Bobas, 2 Hans, although splitting between the type of Hans. Ultimately, Yellow Han took it down once again. I don't know if this was the same player or if somebody was able to copycat it real quick. Maybe they had teammates there that were also running it. This field is weird. I'll be honest, I've never been super high on Bosk, so it's just kind of mind-blowing to me that Bosk is doing so well in this. Was it a reaction to any of the other decks or the other events? I'm not sure, but it is cool to see 3 of them up there. I wanted to try Bosk at locals this week, so we'll see if that materializes. I got to find time to actually sleeve it up. As far as the matchups go, I could definitely see Sabine beating Bosk in the top bracket. You would think Bosk would have the tools, and it probably does, but the problem is that Bosk, or just green-red villain in general, can sometimes get behind the 8 ball. You don't really have a lot of great heals, and then suddenly couple 4 causes and you're out of the game. Now, the Yellow Han was able to take down Young Han. Bosk versus Boba Yellow, that kind of makes sense to me. I have to imagine a lot of people are going to go, oh, well, you could just bounce your own stuff to remove the bounties. And it's like, do you really want to spend a card and tempo to remove the upgrade? It's not great. Now we see in the the last game in the bracket, it goes the other way. At least one of these bosses on ECL, some of them were on 30-point basis. So we did see a variety between them. Again, we don't have a lot of the specifics for this, but ultimately we end up with a Yellow Han taking it down. Was it the identical list? I'm not clear on that. But either way, it's actually very interesting to me that these Han lists are doing so well and taking this down. Maybe this is Set 2's Yellow Boba, and we're discovering it early, and it's going to kind of take over. But we have these Gen Con events coming up very soon, so we'll see how that plays out. Now, I mentioned earlier the K-Mitch. That's who put these numbers together, so shout out to them for doing this. This is actually very interesting, the way all of this is breaking down. Now, it includes an event that I was not able to get all the details for. You can see the top 8. That's the German Nationals event there on the 28th. That actually got 77 players, which was obviously is slightly larger than even the 2K for Baltimore. It's not really surprising to see where the direction the meta is going, at least early on. Boba Yellow is an incredibly powerful deck throughout set 1, especially towards the end, and people had only just started adapting to it right around the time that we got set 2. So with set 2 showing up, we are seeing some unique builds appear. I mean, the Iowa 1K did, for example, feature the Tarkin Yellow list. Is that something that people should be worried about? Personally, no, especially if the Boba Yellow lists are going to continue to be popular, or Yellow X for that matter, because Bounce is that deck's worst nightmare. It is dangerous, don't get me wrong. You could definitely do well at locals, maybe even some store showdowns. I personally wouldn't sleeve it up without some new tech showing, not literally the card tech, but some new technology showing up to help buoy that. We have a bunch of singletons: Boba Blue, Boba Red, Han2 Green, Han2 Red, and Kira Green. Some of these I could see showing up again, and not all of them necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see them. If you're going to talk about tiering decks, there are ones that, yes, you expect to see them. I will see them, say, in a 5 or 6 round event or more. I'm going to see them 2 to 3 rounds of those events, and some number of them will top 8. But a lot of this comes down to, are we looking at the general event metagame, or are we looking at the winner's metagame for the event? What do I mean by that? Is it going to be what I have to fight through in the Swiss, or is it going to be what I have to fight in the top 8? And how much overlap is there between those two, and which do you want to prepare for? Because it's entirely possible that you make the correct meta call for the tournament at large, but ultimately, that's not what you would face in the top 8 because those other decks dodged matchups or were able to cruise through for other reasons. And that's always the complicated part of trying to prepare for events. But like I said, Boba Yellow showing up at these numbers, Sabine showing up in these numbers, not at all surprising. I'm a little surprised by the quantity of Palpatines, but that is kind of buoyed by the Friday event from Baltimore. We'll see if that carries through going forward. Bosk is, I mean, we'll see. I don't want to attribute it to this is a one-off, but I got to try Bosk myself. So I'm going to kind of reserve judgment on that for now. The other Han lists, I'm not sold on. The Han Yellow list definitely looks enticing. I expect to see a lot of those going forward. At least people trying them out. We'll see if that actually translates to continued success for the deck. The Han 2 lists kind of feel a little all over the place at this point. I don't know if they've congealed into the appropriate one yet. Personally, I'm really surprised by Luke. I've lost to it in set 1. I've seen a lot of people play it, and I'm just never impressed. It just feels very fair. I'm a little surprised that they weren't just replaced by the Rey Red decks, personally. I'm kind of high on Rey Red just because of the discard element, so it feels like you can have an opening in a variety of matchups that you wouldn't otherwise have. But there's some cool stuff here, and I don't think we've touched on everything for this particular metagame. So let me know what your thoughts are, because I want to try and do more of these analysis type of videos going forward, looking at events, looking at deck lists. I'll of course be doing this for local store showdown season and other events as my wife and I are preparing for trying to compete ourselves. But that's going to do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Random Thoughts.